Good day and welcome to London, a city that Carol and I have spent a lot of time in over the years, both as a tourist and the many meetings that I have attended in London. If you have never been to London, I hope you enjoy our trip today. Those of you that have been there before, I hope that it will do some refreshing of great memories that you had during your visit. The name London was derived from Londinium. Originally, the Romans had settled what we now call London on the banks of the Thames, and they called it Londinium. No matter how many flights that I've made across the Atlantic, it always amazes me how many flights that there are going across the Atlantic every evening. Approximately, until the virus came along, there was approximately 2,500 flights that would leave the United States and cross the North Atlantic going to Europe. Most of them going to London. London, or the greater part of London, is the area that is shown in red on this greater map of the United Kingdom. The water below is the English Channel, and the water up to the right is the North Sea, to the left the Irish Sea. We're going to be focusing on a little white dot in the middle of all that red, not the City of London, because that's only a 1 mile square area, but what's called the downtown part of London. Our visit begins at one of the three major airports, the largest one, Heathrow, one that I've spent a lot of time, and yes, spent a lot of time sleeping on the floor there overnight sometimes. It is unique in a country that has a lot of socialism, shall we say, that this airport is not run by the government. It is private. It is a privately held and privately run airport, but it is one of the busiest airports in the world. Yes, when you're making the approach from east to west, final landing, you go right over some houses. I don't know why people still live there. One of the little innovations that private technology has brought to Heathrow is these people movers. We have people movers in some airports in the United States, but I find this one unique. You go down to, after you get off your aircraft and you want to go to, say, another terminal or to the parking garage, you go in and you go to a computer, you tap in or type in where you want to go. You go on this little people mover. There's nobody driving it. It takes you to where you want to go. Traditionally, when you visit London, particularly when we first went there back in the late 60s, you needed an umbrella with you at all times. Today, thanks in part, maybe not thanks, but thanks to global warming, you need shorts and a sunscreen. It can get very warm in London these days. It has had temperatures up in the high 90s during the summer. Don't ever be chided by a London type person about your American accent. In reality, if you look up history, the British accent was very much close to the accent of the time of the American Revolution here in the United States. But it was very similar to how we speak as Americans today. But you need to be aware of words. Some of the ones that I want to call your attention to, a restroom is called the loo. The tap is the faucet, the water faucet. If you need a napkin when you're dining, it's called a serviette. The main shopping street is the High Street. If you need a Band-Aid, it's called a plaster. Gammon is ham. And if you need to line up, and the British love to line up, if you're going to take a bus, you just don't gather in a group, you line up, and it's called a queue. The first police commissioner in London was known as, his first name was Robert, and ever since, the police have been known as Bobbies. Trust me, they are the most friendly police force in the world. They have helped me out many times with directions and other issues. When we lived there in the 60s, police did not have guns at all. At all. But as time moved on in the 70s and 80s with increased terrorism, particularly for the Ireland problem or Northern Ireland problem, the police had to have guns to deal with that problem. So today, about 20% of the police have guns. Transportation. London has its famous taxis. Well, what you don't know is, or may not know, is drivers have to take an exhausting test. A test that constantly changes, and they have to select out of 20 questions the fastest route from point A to B. It takes about 18 months for somebody to study all of these various routes. And it's not uncommon to find an aspiring taxi driver riding around London on a bicycle trying to figure out the fastest routes from point A to point B. I would call your attention to the picture in the upper right, and notice how the door, the rear door where the passengers would leave from, opens a different way. No, this is not spaghetti. This is the London Underground system. I'm not trying to scare you about taking it. It's very hard to see, but there is a line in the center that's the yellow line, which is called the Circle Line. If you go to London, my advice is, unless you're very adventuresome, stay on the Circle Line. It'll take you to all of the places, and most of the places we'll visit today on that particular line. This is the tube, or the underground. Very nice, clean stations. People very orderly. Again, they queue up. But some of the stations are very, very deep. You see these deep escalators going up and down? There's at least 3 that I'm aware of that have 2 such escalators. You feel you're down in a coal mine almost. But if you remember, the underground or tube became very important to those that lived in London during World War II. It was the place that they could go to escape the bombing. Most of us know this picture. It is the mother of all parliaments, called Westminster. Big Ben to the right. This is a close-up of Big Ben. It is presently undergoing some repair. It has been going on repair for about 9 months. There is an additional 9 months before it will be finished. This is the first repair in over 100 years. Each of the clock faces have over 200 panes of glass. But I would call your attention to the 6th hour on each of the clocks. Those are doors that open up so that they can go outside and do external maintenance on the clock. This is what we would call a joint session, but of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the two different bodies within their parliamentary system. This could be equivalent to what we call our State of Union, where the President comes and talks and lays out some of his or her agenda. But there is a difference. You can see up at the left side of the picture, the Queen sitting on the throne. She is presenting the government's view of the future. The Prime Minister doesn't even get to be up front. He or she stands all the way in the back here on the right. She reads what he or she has put together as the government's program. The top picture is what is called the House of Commons. It is the real legislative body. Some of you may have seen the House of Commons on PBS on usually Wednesdays, Wednesday afternoon in England around 2:30. The Prime Minister is required to come to, if he's in the country, to come to the House of Commons and for 45 minutes answer questions from the rest of the members of the Parliament. This can get pretty noisy. It can get very loud. But one thing it does not get, it does not become negative. It becomes negative. It may question what the Prime Minister has had to say, but there will be no use of ill language, and it will not denigrate the individual. It may say something about the individual's programs, but not the individual. It can be quite a noisy experience, but it is also a positive experience. The picture below is what they call their upper house. It is the House of Lords. There are many people that question why there is a House of Lords, because they are not elected, they are appointed. And they appoint some of them for lifetimes. And so you pass down as an heir, but they review all of the major bills once it goes through the House of Commons. The House of Commons can override a vote down by the House of Lords. This is a picture of the question time that I mentioned. It's not the current Prime Minister, but this is the previous Prime Minister, and these are his cabinet members behind him sitting on the green bench. He or she will generally answer all the questions, but if it is a particularly technical question, he would call on one of his ministers or cabinet members. As I said, it can get very boisterous. In the past, there have been some occasions where there have been some fisticuffs, but not today. They may yell at each other, they may accuse each other of doing wrongdoings, but it is still polite in the end. I took this picture many years ago, and I would show it to my British friends, but it's a bunch of garbage scows to take out the junk. And I always thought it was fitting sometimes around Parliament with some of the discussions they have. I wanted to orient you. This is downtown London, and it's an area that we'll be visiting today. The blue area going through is the River Thames. It is not the River Thames, it's the River Thames. If you see a green area there, that is St. James Park. We were just to the right of that. You may not see it on the TV, but that's Westminster Bridge and the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. We're going to go to Westminster Abbey, better known or officially known as the Collegiate Church of St. Peter at Westminster. We know it as Westminster Abbey. There have been 39 kings and queens that have had their coronation at Westminster Abbey. Looking at the external, you'll notice it's pretty clean. Wasn't that way when we were first there in the late 60s. In the 70s and 80s and all the way up through the 90s, they took an extensive program in London and elsewhere in England to clean off all the coal, soot, and all of the mold and things that accumulated over time. They steam cleaned it, and it was amazing to see the difference in color of the stone afterwards. One of the unique things about Westminster Abbey, internally, it is also a place of interment of some very famous people that have died. When you first walk in through the main entrance, you will come to the grave in the center. It is their unknown soldier, like ours unknown tomb of the soldier in Virginia, in Arlington. It is the first thing that you see and is always surrounded by poppies. But as you move throughout the chapel, you will see famous names of people. Handel, Darwin, Kipling, Dickens, so on and so forth. The center lower picture is known as Poets' Corner for all the poets that have died and have interned there. This is the far end of Westminster Abbey. One of the things that is troubling today, but I understand why they did it. When we first went there in the 1960s, you could walk in and walk throughout the entire of Westminster Abbey. Today they charge. And it came down to there were so many tourists walking around that they needed to do a much better job of upkeep of the Abbey. And so they charge in order to continue to maintain that Abbey. Again, some of the interior. Pictures to the left are where various individuals depicted in the statues are interned. If you were to go to a weekday service, and there are services there every day, or a Sunday service, you can, and no charge. It's not all the way up in the nave of the church, but in the back. And I've had the pleasure of where this gentleman off to the left, my father-in-law and I sat there one Sunday morning for a service. This is the wedding of Edward and his future queen. If you look down below, you see the queen in yellow and Prince Harry and some of the other royals all around. If you heard or saw my Scottish presentation, you will recall me talking about the scone of Scotland. That's a stone underneath that chair, very, very old chair. It was stolen by some of my relatives and taken back to Scotland. I won't go through that story again, but this is where the Queen or King of the United Kingdom is crowned. It's moved out into the center of Westminster Abbey when that occurs. We now move out of Westminster Abbey and down the road, about a quarter mile, maybe a third of a mile, and we come to Downing Street. Downing Street is very famous because that is where the home of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Downing Street is that little alley almost that sits off of the main road called Parliament Road. And it's to the back there. You'll see a green space and then some brown. Those are some townhouses. These are all cabinet or various government offices, but the Prime Minister lives back there. There are actually 3 townhouses, and one is where the Prime Minister lives. The 2 others are the senior members of his cabinet, his or her cabinet. This is the world famous number 10 Downing Street, probably as famous as the White House. Unfortunately, you cannot get as close to number 10 today as you can when I took this picture. Back in the 60s, actually even in the 70s, you could go up and stand right there. There would be a policeman standing by the door. And I have another picture of my son standing right there with the policeman. Today, this is as close as you can get to number 10 Downing Street. That happened because of the Irish issue problem in the 70s and 80s. And at one point, there was a vehicle down the street. Some vehicles in Europe just have a tarp over the roof, like a convertible, and there were rockets inside of that vehicle that were launched at number 10 Downing Street. They did not hit the building. They caused some damage elsewhere, but immediately they upped their defenses and you cannot get to them. You will notice that there are policemen in the foreground and they are carrying automatic weapons. Something you never saw when Carol and I first lived in England. We move further down Parliament Street and we come to Whitehall. Whitehall is the equivalent, this is the older part of Whitehall. There are actually buildings on either side, but this is the equivalent of the United States' Pentagon. You will notice that there is a soldier in dress outside, and you will notice 2 arches to the right. During most parts of the day, you will find soldiers on horses there guarding Whitehall. They will be astride one of these very gorgeous horses. Each day they have to polish those uniforms and they get inspected before they go on duty. To the back of Whitehall, and that building in the back is part of Whitehall, again, their equivalent to the Pentagon. In this time of year, they celebrate the Queen's birthday with what's called the Trooping of the Colours, and hence all of these stands or seating areas behind Whitehall. And here's the Queen out inspecting it before. The Trooping of the Colour becomes a celebration of her birthday, but it's not really her birthday. It's her traditional birthday. Her real birthday is in March. This is the Trooping of the Colour. All of the light guards, whether it be Scottish regiments, Northern Ireland regiments, even the Welsh Guard, or the traditional British soldier. Well, what I want to call attention to, it just is amazing to me. These 2 horses with the kettle drums on them, you notice they're playing the drums and not holding the reins. They control the horses by their feet. We move further down the road and we come to the world famous Trafalgar Square. The statue with the gentleman that's hard to see, but at the top is Nelson, commander of the British fleet that defeated the French fleet at Trafalgar. The four panels that are at the base of that statue were made originally from melting down 4 French guns. The building at the back is the National Art Gallery, founded in 1824 and has over 23,000 paintings by 76 artists dating back as early as 1300. These are some of the pictures, if you go into that museum, that you would see. This is the British Art Museum, different from the National Gallery. Two of them get confused at times. We now move to another place that is familiar to you, particularly if you listen to symphonic music on PBS or whatever by records. You might be familiar with St. Martin's in the Field. It sits up into the upper right corner of Trafalgar Square. You might know it because a lot of musical programs are recorded there. And there is an orchestra and a choir known as St. Martin's and the Field. Both of them are directed by Sir Neville Marriner. You might be surprised to know that Westminster Abbey is not the parish church of the royals. St. Martin's in the Field is their home church. This is a statue of George Washington. Now, you're still in Trafalgar Square. Why is George Washington there? Particularly since George Washington swore that he would never step foot in England or the United Kingdom. The statue was erected in 1924 by the state of Virginia as a tribute to the relationship between the United States and the UK. But the statue was not erected on British soil. Virginia imported a number of yards of soil from Virginia, which is placed underneath the statue. Just off of Trafalgar Square is what's called the West End. The West End is the theater district. Compared to, say, New York and Broadway, or even other theaters around the United States, the theaters in London, for the most part, are relatively small, smaller than you would see here. But it is a delight. Whether we lived in Brussels or we lived in England, Carol and I used to love to come and go to plays in the West End. We don't remember one of the first plays that we saw back in the 60s. And it has a cast member who was probably at that time around 30 years old. But it's somebody that many people know here in the United States today as Dame Judi Dench. This is Regent Street. It's probably could be equivalent to, if you know much about New York, Park Avenue in New York, the high-end shops. Guess who owns the land underneath those shops and many of the buildings? The Queen. The Queen owns property around London that is worth about $18 billion. $18 billion. The properties alone in London, and she owns properties all over, brings her over $500 million a year. 75% of that income goes into the UK Treasury, and 25% goes to run the Queen's palaces and pay the royal stipends. A lot of people say we should get all of the money, but the Queen brings a lot of tourists to London. Hence, a lot of tourist dollars. We move out of Trafalgar Square and go through the Admiralty Gate and the road that will be leading to Buckingham Palace. We're actually looking through that gate into Trafalgar. Buckingham Palace will be behind us on about a mile down the road. If you look in the park and you look all the way up at the top center, that is the Admiralty Gate coming down to the palace, Buckingham Palace. There's a small lake to the right of the palace. It's called St. James Park. It is a lovely park that Carol and I have sat there many times, watching people walk through, watching the ducks and the birds and so on and so forth. But most people come down that road, which is called the Mall, and they come to Buckingham Palace, and they see the front of the palace. The palace is much larger, and it has surrounding grounds and grounds in the back, at which the Queen holds at various times of years garden parties. She even has a little lake and a place for greenhouses and so on. A very, very, very attractive place to live. This is more the traditional view of Buckingham Palace. And you can see the guards that are guarding the front, those little red figures with all the tourists. They're there because at 10 a.m. every morning there is a changing of the guard. And it's a big tourist thing. It's a good thing to go to. It's a good opportunity to watch some very precise military processions. This picture is not real. It is a wax from Madame Tussauds, the Wax Museum. I am sure that they've taken Henry and his wife out of that presentation today, but there's pretty good likenesses. The two people in the front are just a joke. That is, the people behind are the likenesses of the rest of the royal family. One of the interesting facts is Elizabeth owns a lot of land. You need to remember that she's not just Queen of the United Kingdom. She's Queen of a number of countries. Those include Canada, Australia, New Zealand, so on and so forth. And as such, when there are parks and national parks, she's effectively the owner of that land, as well of other. She, as the slide says, she owns 1/6 of the entire land's Earth's surface. Must be nice. A little bit more close-up of Buckingham Palace with the redcoats and their high hats there as ceremonial guards. you'll notice that there's a flag at the top of Buckingham Palace. When the flag is up, that means that the Queen is in residence. If the flag is not there, she's not there. And during the summer, she's not there because she's in Scotland. And so you can now tour parts of Buckingham Palace when she is not there for a price. But let's tour it together today. This is the grand staircase. Very ornate. Every time I look at this, I think about how not only the construction of the very ornate staircase and banister, but who goes around and dusts that every day? It's a problem for Carol and I to keep our house dusted. And it's only, 1,800 square feet. You must have people just sitting there with feather dusters all day. Very ornate. Again, as I say, when I look at these places in Europe, and again, Newport, Rhode Island, the ability, the artistry it took to put all of this together. This is the grand dining room in Buckingham. If the president were to come, he would sit up at the head. The Queen would start out by sitting up in one of those two chairs along with her husband before coming down to the main table. Now, if you have the opportunity to go and dine with the Queen, I need to make one caution. When dining, eat quickly. It would be, you'd be wanting to chat with the people around you, but I'll warn you, you may not get to finish your dinner if you do not eat quickly. Because when the Queen is finished and she doesn't talk to anybody, everybody is finished. The plates are all lifted. You may have seen in some of, excuse me again. You may have seen in some of the British shows on TV that all the plates, all the napkins, all the knives and forks are spaced equally. They go to utmost attention. Most of Buckingham Palace is offices of the Queen and other folks that serve her, but she has a area of the castle which is actually to the back of the castle of the previous pictures where she lives. This is the Queen's bed. This is the Queen's sitting room. And yes, that's the Queen walking out, studying some papers. All laws must be signed by the Queen. Yes, Parliament enacts the laws. It's approved by the House of Commons, but the Queen must sign them. But unlike the President, she does not have a veto power. She can question the Prime Minister and ask him perhaps to reconsider part of a law. But if Parliament says that's the law, she must sign it. So in a lot of ways, she's a figurehead. These are some of the carriages when, say, going to the trooping of the guards or a wedding or so on and so forth. Actually, the picture at the left, they're not real. They, again, are a stuffed bodies, mannequin, whatever you want to call them. The picture in the center is not stuffed of the horses. Those are pretty neat stalls that the horses are kept in, and it's the building to the lower left, the barn where the horses are kept. I always wonder in the hot summer, looking at the gentleman with his coat on. He's the driver of the coach, and how he must get awful hot. You notice he's wearing medals because they are usually retired military that drive the coaches. We again come back to reorient ourselves here in central London. We're now going to move from that St. James Park, that green area, to in the center of the picture, lower center, over towards Hyde Park, in an area of London called Knightsbridge. This is the world famous Harrods. It is a neat place to go and window shop. I didn't say buy, although the food on the lower level is what is a food court is delicious. But if you go into the upper levels, it's a great place to shop, but not buy. That's because I'm going to tell you of a better place. I used to go in there and look for gifts that I would bring home, and then I would go to another store that I'll show you later. This is the interior of Harrods. This the lower level on the right is, as I called it, was the food shop, butcher shop down the right, all sorts of candies, and so on and so forth. I must say before leaving Harrods, you can buy everything from a vehicle to clothes to even a house. They have a real estate division. We're now going to move on to a place that if you were watching PBS in the last couple of weeks, it is called Royal Albert Hall. It is the home during the summer of the British Proms. The Proms are a summer music festival that began in 1895. It is a major cultural event, and the last night of the Proms are broadcast to 47 countries around the world. Normally the center, in the picture on the right, has chairs, but not on the last evening. The chairs are taken and people go and stand and they go up and down with the music. The reason I said that you might have noticed it on PBS recently, last summer, not a year ago, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, not on the last night, but performed at the Proms 3 nights during the summer. We now move up to the entrance to Hyde Park. This does not look like Hyde Park. It's actually the street where the vehicles are is Oxford Street, and we'll come to Oxford Street in a few minutes. But this is the arch, marble arch. Originally, it was built in front of Buckingham Palace. But in 1825, it was moved. The Queen at the time did not like the view. It blocked her view of the St. James Park. And so it was taken apart and moved and recreated at the entrance, the northern entrance to Hyde Park, in 1837. This is Hyde Park, center of London, in central London. Those of you from New York or visited New York might say, New York has a Central Park. They've been doing it longer than we have. Hyde Park originally was the hunting ground of the kings and queens. I know this part very well. If you were to look at this picture over to the lower right, you'll see a white building. That is the previous, and I'll come to that why in a minute, U.S. Embassy, where I went for many meetings or pre-meetings to meetings that I then held with UK representatives, which would have been over the other side of the park, and those pathways I've walked through many, many times going to meetings. Hyde Park is a place that Londoners love. On a nice sunny day, you'll see that open area just full with people out on the grass, sunbathing. But it's also, if you want to get from one part of town, say Oxford Street, over to Knightsbridge, which is the part over on the left, the easiest way is to walk through the park, and it's a delightful walk. As I say, there are many nice little ponds, fountains, and pathways, and although not seen in these pictures, a bridle path that goes around the park. At one part of the park, this is a rather new site. It is a oval or ring of water that is going around and around over small dams and man-made created rapids. It is the Princess Diana Memorial Ring. My favorite place in Hyde Park. It's called Speaker's Corner. It's in the northeast corner of Marble Arch. When we first went there, it was only on Sunday afternoons that you had a thing called Speaker's Corner. It's a small little area, maybe less than an acre, where you can get up on a soapbox or on a ladder, and you can say whatever you please. Nobody can stop you. The only thing you can be stopped for is inciting a riot or causing somebody else to do somebody bodily harm. But you can say anything, and trust me, they do. But the fun of it is, it's not just the speakers, but it's the crowd that surrounds the speakers, that engage the speakers. They don't attack them, that they question them loudly, like in Parliament. It's the people's Parliament. It is great fun. Love the guy. This is one guy out there. Hate to say it, but it's going to get worse, and sometimes it does. This is a little residential area of London, but I pointed out because this is where you cross the road. And the zigzag lines before that are for cars. That's a London taxi in the picture, center of the picture. Once you step onto the thing, and it's called a zebra crossing. See, it looks like a zebra. Cars have to stop. It is great, and they do. Londoners are very polite. This is another crossing, not a zebra crossing, but controlled by lights. This is one of the main intersections. The road going from the lower right to the upper left is Oxford Street, the High Street or main shopping street in London. But the lights will go red for all of the traffic, and you can cross in a normal way or you can cross diagonally. Another thing that I would tell you if you're driving in London, one thing, don't Cars are restricted in London. It's very slow. You could go faster in downtown London in a cart driven by a horse than you can by a motor vehicle. But you're also charged to go into London. It's a charge in order to prevent traffic from coming into downtown. It's a charge to push people into using public transportation, and they do. This is Selfridges. Again, if you watched PBS, you may have watched a show about a department store called Selfridges. It was not built by an Englishman. It was built by a gentleman who came to London for his fortune from Chicago, and he built Selfridges. Selfridges is where I tended to buy my gifts. If it cost £10 in Harrods, I could buy it for £8 in Selfridges. This is another building in downtown London. To the Brits, they call it the Anti-Beeb, for the organization that resides there. It is the headquarters of the BBC, or the British Broadcasting System. I mentioned earlier the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy is pictured on the left. It's a place that I know well, particularly the third floor of this building to the left, as well as the cafeteria that's in the basement. But for some reason, the United States decided to move its embassy. Moved it out of downtown area, or central London, down to what's called the docks area. And that is the new building on the right. It cost $1 billion to construct, and it has almost a moat going around it. I think they built it that way because during terrorism times and some anti-war demonstrations, there were some physical threats to the building. Not by people with guns, but just by the sheer number of people trying to get into the U.S. Embassy. This is one of the number of train stations, this one going up into the northwest part of, trains leaving here going to the northwest part of England. You might be able to know the name of this station because of the toy bear. It's Paddington Station, and the place where the stories originated about Paddington, the traveling bear. This is King's Cross. Picture down at the lower left is of platform 9 3/4. It doesn't exist. Your grandchildren, maybe even your children, know of this platform and know of the lady standing there next to the steam train. She is J.K. Rowling, the author of the series of books about Harry Potter. And this is where, in the books, he took the train. I'm going to tell you a story about this train station. I was once up in the northern part of England, about 4 hours train ride north. And it was a beautiful, clear blue day sky when I left northern England on the train to come down to King's Cross. But by the time I got to King's Cross, I was in the middle of a blizzard. There was about a foot of snow on the ground where you see these cars. When I got to King's Cross, I was coming down and I had a plane later in the day to come back to the United States. I called out to the airline and they said, sorry, because of the blizzard, none of the planes could land at Heathrow and they've gone on to Central Europe. I said, when will they be back? We don't know. What should I do? They said, find some lodging. Well, I was in an area of town at King's Cross that I was not very familiar with. I used to stay in areas over near the U.S. Embassy or further up in a place called Sussex Garden. But with the snow, I decided I wasn't going to try to get from there to the other place because it was about 2 miles away. So I did what I usually do. I walked up to the first bobby or policeman I could see, and I said, I need a place to stay. Can you recommend one? And he said, yes, I can. And he told me how to go out of the station and go down a certain street and go to the Hotel California. And he said, go and see if they have any rooms. I did, and they did. But he told me, if they don't have a room, don't go anywhere else. Come back and I'll help you out. But as I said, they had a room. It wasn't until the next morning when I got up and started to figure out what I was going to do, I wound up going out to the airport, I realized why he told me only to go to the Hotel California. I was in the middle of the red light district. All the other hotels were used by prostitutes. Nearby at King's Cross is another fictional doorway to 21 Baker Street, the fictional home of Sherlock Holmes. We now move to another cathedral. This is known as St. Paul's Cathedral. It was where Prince Charles and Diana were married. Little story, I was going up those steps with Carol one day, and I've told you about working on Block Island and a number of people that I worked with. One was a fellow who, at the time I worked with him, was going to Brown University. As we were walking up these stairs, and this was probably 20 years later than when I had last worked at the Narragansett Inn on Block Island, the fellow I worked with came out of St. Paul's and we had a reunion. First time in 20 years that we'd seen each other. This is the inside or interior of St. Paul's Cathedral. Very, very, very ornate. Compared to Westminster Abbey, Westminster Abbey is got all these people buried there, but it's kind of sterile. This is very bright and ornate. This is more of the interior. We now move down to the Thames River, which goes through the central of London and goes down to the coast and out into the English Channel. Some of you may recognize those structures there in the river. I said, I've seen them before. Well, if you watched my presentation on the Netherlands, and particularly their control of rivers and dams, the Dutch built for the English these barriers. Underneath the water, there are barriers that come up to protect. That is because in the winter there can be very ferocious storms that drive the North Sea up the Thames, and there has been flooding over the years in downtown London. When that occurs, these gates come up to stop the water. This is London Bridge. Don't have a card picture of London Bridge here in London. This is a picture way, way back. It has a commercial, as you can see, all the carts and everything going across it, linking the two parts of London. But it also has some negative things. When people were executed, sometimes their heads were put on the outside of the bridges and left there for the birds to peck away at. But London Bridge is not there today. It was taken down stone by stone and sold to Americans. The bridge was purchased for a retirement community. We don't have it here at CLV, but it was purchased by a 55-plus retirement community in Havasu City, Arizona. They created a river for it. It's really a lake, and it was rebuilt there in Arizona. This is another bridge. You can see Parliament and Big Ben in the back. This is Parliament Bridge, and it is painted green because if you'll notice, the benches in Parliament, at least the House of Commons, were colored green, discolored green. A lot of tourists come and think this is London Bridge. You know, the old saying, as a kid, London Bridge falling down, London. It's actually a drawbridge that opens up, and it's known as Tower Bridge. It is near the Tower of London. This is the Tower of London. It's a place you do not want to be taken. In its existence, which is over 400 years old, dating back to the 13th century, there's been buildings here, not 400. There have been 400 people executed within the walls. These include innocent people like the wives of Henry VIII. The last person executed here was in 1943, and it was a German spy who had parachuted into England. Most of those that were executed here were brought up from the Westminster area by boat, and they entered in at high tide through Traitors' Gate, brought up the steps, and were executed. Not always immediate execution, but most time immediate execution. One of the individuals that was not executed immediately was Mary, Queen of Scots. She was imprisoned in this room for 19 years before being executed. This is the Jewel Room. It's located in the Tower of London. I remind you, the Scottish Jewel Room is in Edinburgh Castle. This is the English Jewel Room, although they like to say it's the jewels of the United Kingdom. You can see the jewels on your visit. This looks like an advertisement for Beefeater Gin. It is better known as the Tower Guards or the Beefeaters. They are retired military who live within the compound known as the Tower of London, and they are the ceremonial guard. Trust me, the real guards with guns are out of sight. Traditionally, the guards are all male, but it's changed. Not the best picture of this lady, but we now have women who retired from the military again, who are known as Beefeaters. One of the things that most tourists don't know, and even a lot of Londoners don't know, that London has a lot of streams that feed the Thames River, but you don't see them. That's because they're underground. And there are workmen, teams of workmen, that keep these streams, or these tunnels where the streams are fed, free. So they're constantly going around down these ladders and making sure that there aren't branches or leaves that would clog up and cause a flood. Always got to talk about food. For the most part, British food is bland. It would go over well here at CLV. Not a lot of spices. The one that we're most famous for is fish and chips. And Carol and I love fish and chips, particularly with vinegar on the chips. Chips are potatoes, in case you didn't know that. But one of the things that is almost an oxymoron, the Londoners love, or UK or English people love Indian food, hot Indian food. Everything else they eat is bland, but they love hot Indian food. And as this slide says, there are more restaurants in London that are Indian than in the two largest cities, and India has very large cities. It's amazing to me. Let's look at some of their foods. Fish and chips and good old mushy peas, a nice flam type dessert. This is a typical English fry-up breakfast with your eggs, gammon, toast, bangers, and they'll even put some of Scottish blood pudding in there. Just some typical fruits, and always got to have. They do like their sweets. The Brits consume more sugar than any country in the world. The dish at the lower right is stolen from Yorkshire. It's Yorkshire pudding and roast beef. As I said, they love their desserts. When I first went there, I grew up in New York City or outside New York City, and I loved jelly donuts as a kid. So I went into a bakery, bought myself a couple of jelly donuts. And I put it in, I grabbed it, and I bit down on it and almost spit it out. It was like biting into pure sugar. Markets. You can buy anything you want in the markets surrounding London. They're a neat place to go and shop. And yes, you can bargain sometimes with the proprietors. They sell everything from food and the right, to flowers. The Brits, like Europeans, love their flowers, to clothes, to even mules, like the Belgians love. This, you could say, was the beginning of shopping centers. Individual stores covered. Remember, it rains a lot, or used to rain a lot in London. And so they were the first to put their stores interior, make malls out of them. They even had your butcher shop there to the left, and your tavern or pub straight ahead. The Brits love sport. You've got Wimbledon, you've got soccer, and you've got cricket. I gotta tell you about cricket. Cricket, I spent a lot of time. We lived there for a number of years. I watched it. I still do not understand it. You see the gentleman with the bigger hat, he's the umpire. And the gentleman to his left is the on-deck person, as we would in baseball. He's the next to bat. The gentleman with his leg lifted up on the right, he is known as the bowler. He stands behind the referee, runs up and throws the ball. And right next to the gentleman who's bent over with the hat on, he has a bat. And there are 3 sticks or stakes that come up. The catcher behind the stakes, that is called the wicket. The bowler is trying to knock over those sticks. The batter has a wide face bat. It's a board with a round handle on the end. He is protecting the wicket. Beyond that, I do not understand the game. It can go on for days. A thing they call a test match can go on for 3 days. And they take breaks for tea. And they take breaks for lunch. Scores can go up into the hundreds. It's beyond me. Wimbledon. This is Wimbledon. In the top left, you see many of the courts, all grass courts, if you're not aware. Grass courts have been having problems in recent years. Traditionally, it's been the problem has become rain, lots of rain. But as the heat has increased and the sun has increased and the rain has gone away, the courts have suffered because they have to be mowed very low from the sunshine. So the center court, or the court where the big matches are played, now is covered. So the people attending are protected from the sun and the rain. A lot of people don't like it because it goes beyond tradition. The other thing is they like to be sitting out in the outdoors when they're having their strawberries and cream, which is the order of the day at Wimbledon. This is a soccer match, better known as football in England. This is one of the 4 professional teams that play here in London. Look at the crowds. There can be 150,000 people attending a football match. In 1966, when Carol and I arrived in England, there was a thing going on called the World Cup. The World Cup is only held every 4 years. And teams from around the world compete in a tiered fashion to go to the final match, which is called the World Cup. We were very lucky in 1966 that the World Cup was played in England, and England won. Can you imagine a professional sport that takes 4 years to go up through the various playoffs and then the celebrations that occurred? This is the main home of cricket and where some of the main test matches are played. This is a picture I took a long time ago. It's a picture I adore. Charles Dickens immortalized the old curiosity shop. But the reason I love it is these 5 young girls. This picture was taken in 1968. They're no longer young girls. They've probably grown up and had families and now have, like us, grandchildren. This is modern London. I've shown you a lot of tourist places. The picture on the lower right is the Tower of London, London Tower Bridge, and the various bridges going across the Thames. London is home to 8 million people. Greater London which extends out into an area called the Greater Counties or the Home Counties, goes up to 12 million people. It is a modern, bustling city. It is a financial capital to many countries around the world. It is a place that we enjoyed going. One final place that I'll point out, there's a little oval type building down near the water. That is the City Hall of London. A modern City Hall, not an antiquated, older building like a lot of buildings in London. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation today, and I hope I have 2 more to come. We're going to be coming back to the United States for the next 2, and I'll hope you join me. Until then, stay safe and think about each other.